Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you, Bill. And thank you all for coming out on this warming uh, June afternoon and evening. Um, and I do want to start, um, and let me say, first of all, if my voice starts going down, just do this for me, because I have a tendency to do this sometimes. But I will talk to the back of the room. Um, I have up here that you've had a chance to look at uh, a newspaper article from the New York Times in early September 1861. Many of you may have heard, maybe have read about John Frémont and how he became famous while commanding the army in St. Louis because he freed a slave or two slaves. Um, I'm here to tell you, first of all, he did no such thing. What he did was even more amazing than that. But when you go into history and you study more, and I hope you do, about him, many people will say that, well, he freed the slaves or he issued an emancipation proclamation. He did not. He took a framework, a legal framework, and he applied it to a specific situation, and he manumitted two enslaved men. That was it, because of the conditions that I'm going to explain. And uh, this happened on August 30, 1861. Uh, but before we begin, also, um, I have to make reference to a fellow by the name of Anthony Trollope. Um, he was a British novelist who turned his attention to travel guides. And so he would travel around basically the world and write these hefty books, kind of like the Steve's of the 19th century. Yeah, but these were big books. And so he wrote one, I think it was 2 volumes, called North America, because he had toured North America, including St. Louis and Missouri, in 1861. And what a wonderful time to be here, right? So one of the things, and it is inspired part of what the direction my book took, was that he made a very insightful comment, as sometimes foreigners or strangers often are able to do. And his was that in St. Louis, first of all, let me say, St. Louis was, of course, unique because it was the large city in a slaveholding state. In fact, according to the 1860 census, only New Orleans was larger than St. Louis as a city in a slaveholding state. But one thing we had that New Orleans did not have was Illinois, you see. So I think up until the time that the Supreme Court issued the Dred Scott decision, people had made sort of an accommodation, not that it was good for the slaves, of course, but that was the reason for the rules they adopted, or about you can't take a slave into free territory. Okay. Again, the Supreme Court just dashed all that to shreds. And aside from a terrible war that came about as a result, of course, that was a good thing, I guess I would say. But one observation he made is that if you were in St. Louis and you owned a slave, there were many ways that you could hire out that slave, but one thing that did not make sense for you to do was to keep that slave as a house servant. Okay? And as he pointed out, it's because there were so many Irish and so many Germans that essentially it was cheaper just to hire somebody than to. So one of the things, and again, this is a lot about what this talk in this book is about, one alternate form of employment was the steamboat trade. Okay. And the reason for that was, well, as I say, I think I agree with Trollope. If you were going to make money, you had to hire these people out. And as a result, well, of course, St. Louis in the 1850s especially was just the center of all the trade on the Mississippi. And this gentleman on the right that you see He was a deckhand on a steamship, and the guy on the left, of course, is none other than John C. Frémont. And I will move to the more meaty part of it after I read one other thing that Anthony Trollope observed about St. Louis. You'll appreciate this. The heat in this state in midsummer is very great, especially in the valleys of the rivers. At St. Louis on the Mississippi, it reaches commonly to 90 degrees and very frequently goes above that. The nights, moreover, are nearly as hot as the days. If corresponding severe weather in winter affords any compensation for the heat of the summer, I can testify that such compensation is to be found in Missouri. When I was there, we were afflicted with a combination of snow, sleet, frost, and wind, with a mixture of ice and mud that makes me regard Missouri as the most inclement land into which I ever penetrated. So things haven't changed that much in 160 years. So, now, I want you to ponder this photograph for a while and look very, very carefully at these gentlemen. It's one of the most remarkable photographs I've ever seen, and it's one of the things that inspired me to get into this story. You see how resolute they are, steely-eyed. Well, this was a Grand Army of the Republic unit. Those were veterans from the Civil War, the Union Army. And this photograph was taken in 1909. So it was like 40 years after they had gone to war. The fellow you saw on the first slide, you may be able to find him in this picture. And I'm not going to give it away. There he is. He's in the second row, second from the right. If you disregard the guy with the bowler hat, and please also disregard, don't pay any attention to the kids, the angry kids in the picture. Now, this is just my effort to give you a very, very brief overview of the book. So what you're going to see here is a few points I'll comment on briefly, but the rest of the talk is about the talk, about what I want you to understand about some particular subjects. John Frémont was the Republican candidate for president in 1856. A lot of people don't realize that. Of course, he was the standard bearer of the Republican Party. The election before Abraham Lincoln was elected, he didn't win, but he was a strong member of the new Republican Party. And of course, as we know, they were the party who was moving towards full emancipation. He was picked really not by Lincoln so much, even though Lincoln, of course, knew him very well, but by the Francis Blair family. And then Blair rings a bell in St. Louis, I think, in particular. And if you go to Bell Fountain Cemetery, you'll find a number of them there. But the one most famous in St. Louis is, of course, Francis Jr., Frank Blair, whose statue is at the corner of Forest Park, and who is honored by most people in St. Louis and always has been, I think, because he's viewed as the person who saved Missouri from invasion from the South. I don't happen to agree with it, but you be the judge when we get into it a little further, or after you read the book, even better. Anyway, there were problems with Frémont's relations in Washington. They started almost immediately. Part of it, just a small part of it is that he was assigned to take command of the entire Western Army of the United States from the state of Illinois all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And it took him about 3 weeks to get here. Or maybe more than 3 weeks, because he was in Europe at the time, but he just took his sweet time getting here. And that probably started some friction. The friction increased and went on until he was accused of not responding rapidly enough to a incident in Lexington, Missouri. Any of you been to the Battle of Lexington historic site up along the Missouri River? But Esley has that. It was it had two things, I guess, going for it when you look at it from the standpoint of a Missourian. It was the only battle that occurred in the fall of 1861 of any significance in the entire country, which was because Fremont's counterpart in the East, a guy named McClellan, did nothing. He took over the Army of the Potomac after the disastrous Bull Run, and he sat there. So they expected apparently more activity out of John Fremont, and they really didn't get it. He finally was embarrassed by the Battle of Lexington to announce that he was going to undertake a campaign that go all the way across, halfway across Missouri, then down to Springfield, and he was going to chase those. They weren't Confederates yet; they were called Missouri State Guard. He was going to chase them and drive them out of the state. And well, I'll just say, how did it end? It ended ignominiously in a headquarters tent southwest of Springfield when a guy dressed as a farmer came in with an order in his line of his coat and ripped it out and relieved him of his command, and that was on November 1, 1861. That seems shocking, and part of the story is how did he get there? But I think you'll conclude when you read the book is that it all makes a whole lot of sense. Well, in any case, this is another aspect of the war that I'm going to be discussing in some detail is the coverage of the war. This happens to be this is Leslie's Illustrated Weekly News. This is an engraving from actually a drawing that's much even bigger than this, but this shows Fremont on his grand campaign across Missouri. And well, you can see how it is, what's the word I'm looking for? It's glorified, just the news that people were getting. I just love this engraving, incidentally, but it captures, I guess, the two parts of the book that I want you all to pay attention to. One is the actual campaigns and battles. The other is well, let's call it political propaganda, okay, that is at work all throughout this period of time that basically has its ultimate, it ultimately turns out to be represented by a great cavalry charge outside of Springfield, Missouri. And I'm looking forward to getting to that. But first of all, I think most of you will recognize this. This is just a small part of the Compton and Dry pictorial St. Louis. And I picked this part because it's the centerpiece or the headquarters when Fremont was here for these 100 days. Actually, he was in St. Louis commanding all the troops in Missouri for about 2/3 of that time. And the rest of the time he was off looking to go to Springfield. And here I need my... There we go. Those of you who are Civil War buffs, I think, first of all, I knew I was going to do this, recognize this building here. I think Esley knows what that is.
Well, it was built as a hospital, but it's being used as a prison.
That was a St. Louis Medical College, I believe, run by the crazy Dr. McDowell. And that is, whoa. Man, that doesn't look like it wants to stop. Stop. Okay, this is 8th Street, okay? And at the corner of 8th Street and Shoto was this magnificent home. And I guess I'd say it starts the process of Fremont, let's say his gifts being unappreciated. This was a home that belonged to a cousin of John Fremont's wife, and of course I should have mentioned her earlier. That is Jessie Benton Fremont, the daughter, and some say the favorite daughter of Senator, excuse me, of the senator who was Senator Benton. They managed to acquire this. Now, her cousin had been married to a fellow, and she died somewhat earlier, but he died just a few weeks before Fremont was assigned to St. Louis. So they decided they would rent this, and of course, that's where the trouble starts. Some people have written and say, well, it was a fair amount they paid, but of course, it was a self-interested transaction. So there you go. And I did want to show you another view of that particular building from a different angle. This is a painting on a piece of glass, okay? This was something that people did back in the 19th century. You'd take a piece of glass and you'd put, I guess, the paint that you wanted to be on the front end first and keep building it and building it. And this was done by some German fella. I think his name shows up on there, but I am just delighted to hear that this particular item is in the possession of the Corning Museum of Glass in Corning, New York. So just a little bit. I suppose most people who study the Civil War in Missouri and St. Louis do know what the Camp Jackson affair is, but I'm going to explain it as briefly as I can so that everyone understands it. But we were, of course, a state in a strange position. We had slavery, certainly in the rural areas, but St. Louis had become a melting pot of Germans and Irish and Czechs and because in the 1840s, late 1840s, we both had the famine in Ireland, and we of course had the revolutions that brought all of the Germans and the Eastern Europeans here. And I might say that as my research reveals, not only was St. Louis in 1860 the second largest city in a slave state, it was the city that had, in 1860, a greater percentage of foreign-born people in its citizenry than any other city in the United States. In fact, the only one that had more than 50% of its population was foreign-born. I wish they had saved some of those good old German restaurants, though. So in any case, there was a riot. Most people call it a massacre, when some Union troops that were sent there to disrupt a meeting of the Missouri State Guard. Okay, I didn't explain that, but that was before Missouri joined the Confederacy, although it really never did. But before all that happened, Missouri was represented out in the field by a state-sanctioned group that was kind of a super militia, let's say. And they had lots of good soldiers in it because Missouri had been at war for years before then with the Kansas troubles and all that sort of thing. I had mentioned, of course, the steamboat trade, and that brings me to this point. You're seeing an ad. This was before the Civil War, shortly before for one of the steamboat companies that was one of the biggest. Okay, and all of these things, whether it's red or green, represent a different steamship. Um, and I've highlighted one called the J.C. Swan. I wish I could be sure I was pronouncing that properly, because with my Midwest accent, it could be Swan, but everybody says Swan. And those of you who may live in Webster Groves probably know Swan Street, which is named, the guy had his estate out there. But the boat was named after him, this particular boat. I don't have a good picture of the Swan, but this is a boat called the, I better look at here carefully. The Iatan, okay. The Iatan was not one of the big boats owned by this company, but it was the boat that the national authorities decided to go chasing after the J.C. Swan after the Camp Jackson affair. The reason they were chasing after the J.C. Swan was that steamship had come up from New Orleans in early May. It stopped at Baton Rouge, where the Confederates had just captured the federal armory there, and they took aboard cannon and munitions and rifles and all kinds of stuff. Well, the Union authorities got wind of it, of course, that this boat, again, the Swan, was heading upriver with all these things. And in fact, a good case can be made, and actually an excellent case can be made, that the reason that the commanding officer here, this was Nathaniel Lyon at the time, the reason that he went and captured this group of soldiers was because he learned that that boat had docked and he knew what was on it. And actually he had a sting, he ran a sting, and he let them bring it up to the camp. And so that was enough, certainly, how should I say, provocation to cause him to go down there and arrest everybody. Well, when they tried to arrest everybody, there some shooting happened, and it was really, really tragic. But the fact of the matter is that because the Swan was engaged in acts against the United States government, there was a procedure. It was called the right of prize and capture that had been age-old in the maritime law, whereby Lyon could take that steamboat and condemn it and convert it to the use of the Union Army, like the police will do if they find drugs in your car, as a for instance. They did that. The Iatan and the Swan were among the boats that Lyon took with him when he went and attacked the State Guard, first of all in Boonville, Missouri. Okay. Now, pardon me if I'm talking like a lawyer. It's been so long now, I hardly know how to, but, and first of all, let me say, I'm going to delve into a little bit of the maritime law. Never had a maritime case, never had an admiralty case. And since I no longer have a law license, I resigned. You can't rely on any kind of advice on any subject, but historically, let me explain my interpretation of this. Of course, Fort Sumter happened in April of 1861, okay? But Congress was not in session. Congress, well, it was awfully hard for them to get in session, special session, so they didn't go into session until July of 1861. There was, what you're seeing here is a part of the statute, but I want to point out specifically what you see on the right there. And again, I don't want you to challenge you to read that small stuff, but what this highlighted part says basically is that, in fact, if property is used and employed in acts against the federal government, it does, you do apply the law of prize and capture. Okay, if you take this thing out and you read it very carefully, I suggest you do, you will see, I think, that they fudge on what kind of property they're talking about. They're fudging on, well, is it a boat or is it an enslaved person? Because I think, frankly, there's other evidence of this in the very early stages. The Union people and the abolitionist people did not want to admit that these people were property of another. Okay. And I'm going to say to you, of course, I challenge you to read the book and make your own conclusion. But I do believe that what happened here in St. Louis was a test case, as it were. Okay? And because the Congress had left this up in the air, Frémont winds up in his hands a situation where someone has been used, a person or persons have been used in opposition to the rights of the federal government. But for those persons, there was a special section in the Act, and so you can read that. It didn't say they were free if you captured a slave who was working against the United States for his master or her master. It said, well, if you file a suit to make that person your slave again, they can just say, well, I was working against the United States. It never said what happens next. So again, that's my evidence that they didn't know what to do or what to say. But what Frémont wound up in his hands was not only the J.C. Swan, but two deckhands. Okay? Two deckhands that were there when the I-10 captured the J.C. Swan. We don't know what happened between then and August, but in fact, they fit perfectly into this scenario. And they were the answer. They wound up being the answer about what do you do? His proclamation said, they're free. That's simple enough. They're free. And that was something that I'd say the Congress was not willing to do. The Congress being Congress. Now, this is a slightly different subject. I mentioned that, let's just say we're moving on to something more pleasant, perhaps. But as I mentioned, nothing much was going on in the eastern United States. This is during the late spring and through summer of '61. But meanwhile, all of the activity, it seemed like, was going on in Missouri. In fact, it's been calculated that in 1861, 50% of all of the battles and 50% of all the casualties were right here in Missouri because the Union Army in the East were just stuck in their place. So after the event at Lexington, Frémont took a lot of heat for not doing that. So he says, Frémont was a real pompous fellow, I gotta say. You know, he deserves a lot of criticism for the way he treated everybody. But he said, I'm going to take the field. So he puts, I guess it was about, well, he put himself and his band and his cavalry on steamboats. I'm sorry, himself and the first group of soldiers he put on trains in St. Louis and it took 10 hours to get from St. Louis to Jefferson City because he stopped at every place and the band played and they had a great meal in Herman. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask a question? Sure. All right. Where was this? It says headquarters in Jefferson City, Camp Lily. About where would that have been?
It's a mile south of the Capitol building. A mile south of the Capitol building. Okay, and let me explain. Oh, I did that again.
And the other question I have, it says the press reports the 3 minutes war, the Bohemian Brigade descends on Jefferson.
Okay, I'm going to explain.
Oh, I'm
okay. No, and let me make sure my time's so good. Sorry. Well, first of all, again, to set up what I was talking about is there's nothing going on yet. The people in the north are dying for news of the war. Right? So every major newspaper in New York and in Boston and St. Louis, everybody came out here. And the term Bohemian Brigade, to some of us old enough, that was some term used, at least I think through the Korean War. I mean, I was alive when that happened, but it meant, oh gosh, um, war correspondence, okay? And if you read the book, you'll see the background of how it got the name Bohemian Brigade, and I think you'll find it very interesting. But in any case, the press has descended on Jefferson City. They're waiting for him to start this great campaign towards Springfield. And this is a drawing. This is one of basically hundreds of drawings that were made by correspondents, by artists that traveled with the Army. This happens to be a guy named Henry Lovey, who is my personal bestie, I guess I'd say. But I'd suggest if you're interested in more of this, go to the Boston College website. It's, I'm sorry, it says here, the Becker collection. And these were drawn on site, okay? You can't really see this, and I'm scared to death of hitting that screen again. But he has drawn a scene. He has handwritten instructions that were to go to the weekly, his paper was Leslie's Weekly Illustrated. And that would tell the people that were engraving, actually they had a system, they would engrave small wooden blocks so they could put 30 people to work at one time, converting these drawings into engravings and then getting them in this newspaper. And I swear to God, they could do that. They could turn them around in less than 2 weeks. They had to ship them up there, the drawings, but the news went up there by telegraph, of course, so it was almost instantaneous. Again, I know where this spot is in Jefferson City, but it is most interesting to me as an indication of just the way how John Frémont could drive you crazy, okay? He's up there like some potentate waiting to start this thing, and he's got, these people are described as Hungarians, just Hungarians. He's got his children and his wife and this stage set essentially. So he was a news hound, is what he was. So in any case, let me move on. Oh, and then the other aspect of this is, I think, personified by Frank Bangs Wilkie, because there were not just sketch artists, there were, of course, newspaper reporters. Wilkie essentially narrates the book. And I think when you read the book, you'll see why, because he was following Frémont's army in St. Louis and on the trail, and he was writing letters back to his hometown, Dubuque, Iowa. All those letters have been collected, and it's essentially, it is a travel log. But Wilkie is he's just a strange character, let me say. And but I will give away too much if I give away any on Wilkie. I just say, take a good look for him. Now, just a little bit more on the art side. This is another Henry Lovey drawing. This is a portion of one that wound up in Leslie's newspaper. And again, here we go. you'll see one thing I've observed. He would draw, see that line of horsemen? He would draw that out, and then they'd send it off, and the printers knew, we'll just keep that line going. But Fremont's campaign for Springfield was essentially a disaster. Okay? There's certain humor in the disaster if you read the book, but he was not making the progress he needed to make if he was going to save his job. In fact, just before he left for Springfield from the area around Tipton, Missouri, the Secretary of War shows up in his camp, and he has an order from the General-in-Chief relieving him of command, relieving Fremont of command. And Fremont says, oh, please, let me. This was Sterling Price, who was in charge of all the Southern soldiers that he was chasing. Oh, let me chase. I know I can bring him So anyway, he lets them. It takes him 10 days to make the distance between Tipton and Springfield. And then he sets up, through his cavalry commander, a Hungarian fellow named Charles Zigony, to carry out a magnificent charge against basically the few Missouri State Guardsmen who were still in Springfield. It wasn't intended for anything except for publicity, quite frankly, and hopefully to save his hide. But on the left, you'll see a stone that they've put up in Springfield at a place called Zigony Park. It's been called Zigony Park, I'd say, since the 1930s, but nobody knew what that name meant, I must say, until about 10 years ago. And then they moved this. This is an old monument they moved from where the train station had been to actually the very site of this charge. Now, as if by magic, I will convert this into the final product. You see, now this is a particularly fine example of the art of the engraver, I might say. But this was the drawing made from the engraving made from Levy's drawing that appeared in Frank Leslie's paper. Well, you can see again how it's filled out. But if I say to you that, first of all, Zigony and he had about 300 cavalry with him, that he rode through the night with those 300 men 50 miles so that he could be in Springfield on October 25th, 1861. This phrase down here is meant to engage you, to ask you if you know of anything else that happened on October 25 in a prior year. Well, the charge of the Light Brigade in 1854. And in fact, some of the writers and stuff said they compared it at the time. And that's frankly what Fremont, that's why he sent 19 men to his death, to their death. So he could say, I'm just like, well, he was just like the British because it was a useless charge. And anyway, that was the end of that. And now I think I'm at an end except to discuss Hiram Reed. And this is, of course, the photograph I asked you to look carefully at. This is a page of a Boston Daily Globe that was published in 1911, 2 years after the picture that has, of course, Hiram in the second row. I would not have written a book had I not come across this particular newspaper article. And what it says in all of the words that you can't read there is that this Globe reporter comes and he interviews Hiram Reed because everybody in Nantucket Island, Massachusetts, is talking about Hiram Reed because actually he is the only African American who was a soldier during the Civil War. And he knows, he relates 50 years after the fact what boat he was on, and essentially it filled in all the gaps 50 years after the event. Now, sadly, 3 months after this happened, Hiram passed away. But Hiram was, along with another slave that were crewmates on the J.C. Swan, Hiram was freed because he was engaged by the owners of that boat in acts against the government of the United States, just like the boat was condemned. But thanks to some good luck on Hiram's part, one of Fremont's friends took him with him to Nantucket. And so he lives his whole life out, the rest of his life, 50 years in Nantucket. And he is the first man ever freed by the military authority of the United States in the history of the country. So anyway, there you have it. And it's just a little bit of taste of the book, but I hope you enjoyed the whole thing. But first of all, any questions? Surely. Yes, sir.
Did Grant have anything to do with Fremont?
Yes. Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. Actually, Fremont's 100 days basically were overlapped just barely by Grant's time in Missouri. And Grant became halfway through the 100 days or so. The chief subordinate of Fremont, who was in charge of opening up the river. And well, again, you'll read in the book, but it almost happened that some other new general got that job, and Grant successfully pressed his seniority, and Fremont made that decision. So I guess you could say he made Ulysses Grant.
Did you have any evidence of Grant's opinion of Fremont?
No, I don't think I did. I mean, he was very closed-mouthed, and certainly about things like that. I never remember seeing anything. There's plenty. But Grant was off on his own, pretty much the whole time. Certainly the whole time that Fremont was chasing the state guard across the state. So, but anyway, yeah, you'll find as much about Grant in that book as you will about Fremont. Well, we need more questions? Yes.
So Wilson's Creek happens after this Zagonyi charge?
No.
Wilson Creek happened before?
Yeah, that was August 10, 1861. And let's see, Fremont's reign started at the end of July. But one of the reasons Fremont was in trouble was that he supposedly didn't send enough men to relieve and frankly, that's where the confrontation comes in between the Blairs and the Fremonts, and between Jesse Benton Fremont especially. So again, I'll let you read that. Esley's scratching his nose. I think that means he has a question. Well, anyway, I appreciate you all coming, and I'll be out there selling books and signing books. My grandson will be there to help me on my way. His name is Ashton Wolk, and he's the bright young man sitting back in the back, who I promised I wouldn't mention. Sorry.
Thank you.